Here at MMA 1-to-1, we track over 4,500 fights, 25 years worth of data from the UFC. We track all kinds of things like the submissions that are recorded, the total volume of different finishes, TKOs, KOs, which round they happened in, the total fight time, the total rounds that were fought, whether it was a male or female fight, and many other things. The point here is to try and bring you statistics that will inform your MMA and perhaps your BJJ game, so that you can see how things are trending, how things are moving, how things historically have looked, and adjust your training accordingly rather than focusing in on individual fighter data. This is data from the entire game so that you can see what's going on. This section that we're going to look through today is just our overview page of all the submission statistics. Now, the graphs that you'll see are live, so please wait a little bit for them to load. They'll take a few seconds to load into the page. They're not just static snapshots, they're being updated all the time. The graphs are also interactive, so you can roll over them and see what's going on with various data lines and data points as you go through. So let's get into it. We start with a big picture here, and you'll see that overall in the last 25 years in the UFC there have been 962 total finishes. That's a finishing rate of around 21%. That's for submissions only on this page that we're looking at currently. And a finishing ratio, for context, that's 1 in 4.8 fights that get finished via submission. If we look at the next one, it's basically the total volume of submissions that there have been year on year. So in the early years, the numbers are very low because the amount of fights and events are very low. So if we're looking around the 2000s and the late 90s, there's a handful of submissions each year. And you'll see that there's this massive explosion in around 2005. It starts to really take off. On the site, we refer to that as kind of the modern era. It's 2005 line here is when Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner went to war, and the UFC and MMA hit a real explosion in terms of overall audience and events and fights that they put on, until we peaked here in 2014 with just shy of 100 submissions, and it's been kind of steady in terms of overall events ever since. We actually overlay that on the next graph here, so the grey in this one you'll see is the total amount of fights. So you can see again that big explosion from 2005 onwards until we hit over 500 fights in 2014, and then settled down to just under that 500 fights, 457 in 2017. So as you would expect, if we look back up, the total amount of submissions goes fairly hand in hand with the total volume of actual fights that happened. So more meaningful is for us to have a look at a percentage. So on this one here we can see the percentage of fights that got finished via submission year on year. So you can see that 2004 there were 27%. Here was the high point. If we take out the fairly erratic early years, the high point in the more modern era where the volume significantly increased was 30% in 2007, and you can see it's on a fairly downward trend, coming into around 17.5% for both 2017 and 2018 so far. Now this next graph, we introduce it a few different times. Probably the best way to think of this is market share, right? So this is accumulative data throughout the years. How did the total amount of what's the total percentage of fights that were finished via submission changing year on year on year? So this is not individual year data. This is if you stopped it at a particular point in time, accumulatively in the history of the UFC to that point in time, how many fights were finished via submission. So we can see the peak again really here, if we scrub out some of the early years, is around 2007, where it was almost a 30% market share for submissions versus other types of finishes, decisions, KOs, TKOs, and then more recently that's dropped to around a 20%, 21%, and down to just under the 21% rate in 2018. You can see a clear trend here. So this is the point of these graphs, that you can see a really clear trend and see which way things are going, and it gets rid of some of those erratic lines. So a clear downward trend from particularly 2007 through to recent times. So we get into which types of submissions, right? So we list all the individual submissions and how successful that have been, but we also break that down into categories. So here we break it down into the major categories of, did it happen on the person's neck or did it happen on their limbs? And then we subdivide the limbs into arms and legs. So when you've got all kinds of different submissions coming in, you can cut through the noise and say, okay, how does this actually break down? If you look at this graph here, this is incredibly revealing. You can see that 77% historically throughout the entire UFC, 77% of all submissions have happened on the neck. That would include things like rear naked chokes, guillotine chokes, neck cranks, and then conversely about 23% of that has happened on the limbs. There's some odd submissions which don't fit nicely into these categories. We just omit them, but they're statistically fairly irrelevant at this point, so it doesn't affect the graphs. We can see that arm submissions are far outweighing leg submissions, so less than 4% of all submissions there have ever been happen on the legs, and around just under 20%, 19% happen on the arms. But short story there is protect your neck, because it's the neck that's most likely to get finished on. We just show that again here over the years, so you can see how it's trended, where that's gone. You might suspect that in recent years the leg's been doing better, but in fact the opposite is true. Leg submissions are incredibly prevalent in submission only grappling in the recent years, but that just hasn't seemed to have filtered through or made a big impact in high level MMA yet, certainly in the UFC. So here you can click on the legends, by the way, for any of these graphs, just to clarify some of the lines and data points for when it gets confusing. The blue line here then is the neck submissions, how that's trended over the years, and the purple is the limbs. So generally, because they fall nicely into one of those two categories, you'll see that they are broadly inverted from one another. If you looked at 2016, for example, you'll see that the neck submissions are 89% and submissions on the limb here are 11%. And again, just a tiny fraction, only 1% in 2016. So that would have probably been just one submission actually happened on the leg. There was a period of time, as you can see here, from kind of between 97 to the 2002 point there, where the limbs were actually leading the way. So a lot of arm bars, quite a few attacks on the legs, things were getting finished. But remember, this was significantly less in terms of volume. So it's an interesting trend to see how that's happened, but a lot less volume going on here. More recently, the neck has completely dominated. Next one is a new graph that we've introduced recently, which is a round by round breakdown. So we start with total volume, so how many submissions happened in each round. So 441 in round 1, go back to that to make it clear, 441 in round 1, 285 in round 2, 140 in round 3, and as you would expect, because there's far fewer of them, in round 4 there's 8, and in round 5 there are 7. Now we look at this in terms of percentage chance of you getting finished. So this is, if you fought that round, what was the chances that it finished via a submission? And here you can see that if you fight in round 1, which you obviously will be, there's a 10% chance of it getting finished via submission. This drops a little in round 2 to 9.2%. Goes down quite a long way in round 3. So by the time you get to round 3, there's just under a 6% chance of the fight ending via submission. And then quite interestingly, of the rounds 4 and 5 actually fought, there's a slightly higher chance at 5.2% of you getting finished in round 5 via submission than there is in round 4. We've got a total list here of all the different kinds of submissions and the numbers against them. We'll skip that just for a second and we'll come back to it. First, we're going to look at the overall breakdown via this pie chart. Just for clarity here, this is other submissions outside of the top 10. So we just list them as one slice and the rest of it is top 10 submissions. So the easy story to look at here is the dominance of the rear naked choke. The rear naked choke here gets 36.7 over 350 submissions attributed to it. And the other big one being the guillotine choke, 177 18% basically, and then the armbar in third place, 141, 14% of the submissions. But the big story again here is this just sheer amount of volume attributed to these two. If you looked at just the rear naked choke and the guillotine choke, that's about 55% of all submissions that happen just by those two. So again, that story of protecting your neck, and if you're going to go out and train some defense, it really needs to be against the guillotine and the rear naked choke as a priority, because those are the two that are finishing the vast majority of all the fights. And that's not a trend from a long time ago, that's a trend that continues in the recent years. Interestingly again here, submissions that we might think as very prolific or culturally in submission world very important to us, they actually hit fairly small numbers. So stuff like the Kimura down here at 3.3% of all submission finishes, and even something as well known as triangle choke, a standard triangle choke here coming in at just 6.5% of all submission finishes. Going back up to the list, you can see the real numbers here. We'll let you look at this on the page, we won't go through it in any detail, but you can see these big numbers against the top three: rear naked choke, guillotine choke, armbar, and then starting to fall off for this next section here: Kimura, arm triangle, and standard triangle choke, and then really down in terms of numbers once you start getting towards the lower end of the top 10 and outside of the top 10, so getting down towards just 10 total submissions, down to 3 here for the Bravo choke. Basically anything with less than 3 submissions we don't track in this list, even though we do track them behind the scenes and overall. So continuing down, we already looked at this one. This one is back to the market share concept. This one shows you all the top 10 submissions and how they change market share year on year. But with all 10 in, it can be quite confusing. So we're going to move on. I'm going to skip over this one. This shows you year on year individual numbers for the percentage of finishes via those submissions. But this is the one we want to look at now. This is the top 5 submissions and how their market share has changed over the years through the history of the UFC. So a couple of interesting things to note here. The blue line you can see is the rear naked choke. You'll see that it was, for a period of time between kind of 1999 and 2005, second in the list of overall submissions. So it was not the number one submission that there was, it was the armbar. So you can see that the armbar itself here dominated the pack for a period of time. Again, there was far less events and consequently volumes of fights and submissions that occurred through those years. By the time we hit the modern era, so again 2005 and above, you can see that the rear naked choke starts to dominate, takes away, and no chance of the rest of the pack really ever catching it again, unless something absolutely crazy happens in terms of mixed martial arts evolution. So currently the market share for all time for the rear naked choke is at 37%. If you have a look at the guillotine choke, you'll see again this was third for quite a period of time. So from kind of between 96 through to these years through 2011, 2012, and then 2013 came the point where guillotine choke and the armbar swapped and traded places. So the guillotine choke stole the number 2 spot and the armbar was relegated to third, and the gap has just continued to widen ever since. So as you see it now, the guillotine choke is quite a long way ahead of the armbar in terms of overall stats and numbers. It's a clear second and the armbar is a clear third. Finally, with the 2 triangles, the arm triangle and the standard triangle here, you can see that through the early years they were fairly neck and neck. Both came in 1994 for the first time. And there was a fair gap for the triangle choke from around 2006 right through to 2012, 13, 14, until this gap has started to really close. So the arm triangle has done significantly better than the standard triangle in the last few years. That's why this gap is closing. That's why there's not much to choose between them now. If you look at the triangle choke, you see the numbers in recent years. It's got about a 6% market share, 6.2, 6.4. It's having a pretty good year in 2018 so far, and you can see that it's a 5.7 for the arm triangle in terms of, again, overall market share. Let's Mostly what we're going to look at for this video, there's an interesting one here which is a cumulative volume of submissions throughout the years. So again, you get a real sense of the impact of the great volume increase from 2005. This is if you stack the numbers on top of each other, so just keep adding the total amount of submissions there were each year. You can see these trends. Again, you can see the armbar here on this orange line. Eventually was for a period number 1, lost out to the rear naked choke was number 2, and then lost out to the guillotine choke, which is that red line you see there, and eventually was down to number 3. Best of the rest we'll quickly look at. So again, these are individual stats year on year, bit confusing. We'll come back to that in finer detail on other videos. So again, let's just look at market share. A couple of interesting stories to finish on here. You can see that interestingly, there were some leg submissions that did pretty well in the early years. So you can see the heel hook and the knee bar actually started very well in the early years and had quite a share of the overall statistics, but then that's fallen away. You can see the knee bar line here has steadily dropped, and surprisingly so has the heel hook, so sitting at around a 1.3 and 1.25% market share for both of those. The Kimura has done had a very strong showing here up to mid 2000s, 2006, and then has kind of plateaued ever since. The two most interesting ones here are the Anaconda choke that we see in purple here, came in quite late in the day and steadily stole a market share off other submissions and has performed well ever since, did particularly well in 2017. And then the Darce choke, again fairly late starter, not jumping in until 2007, and then hitting a whole bunch of submissions and stealing effectively what you see now. So 6th is Kimura, 7th is now Darce choke, and you see that's started behind and has quickly overtaken the Anaconda, heel hook and the knee bar. So it's second in that in this pile of 5 submissions that we have here. So some pretty interesting trends that you can see. I expect that the Darce choke and arm triangle will continue to make grounds in both the top 5 one that we saw here and that top 6 one. So the arm triangle doing particularly well as well, and we'll continue to see those trends, but nothing's going to catch the rear naked choke anytime soon, and there's not going to be any significant changes to the fact that the neck is by far and away the most lethal submissions and the most prolific submissions that happen in high level MMA. Do suspect we'll see some better numbers on the leg submissions in the coming years. I hope so, because it'd be a very interesting part of the game for it to see unveiled a little bit in high level mixed martial arts, but we'll wait and see if that actually plays out. Don't forget, you can check all of this stuff and it's updated real time. In other words, the data's put in every time an event happens. MMA1to1.com. This is our overall submission statistics page, where you can, or from here you can drill down into individual years, you can drill down into individual submissions. So if you wanted to check out exact details of how the armbar's doing, you could go and have a look at that in greater detail. And we're adding stuff all the time. Just recently we're starting to add knockout, TKO, KO data, round data, that kind of thing. So some really interesting new stuff coming in the next few weeks. Go check it out, MMA1to1.com.